Hey, welcome to the campfire. Before the story starts, tell me, where are you listening from? And what time is it there? I'd love to know who's still with me in the dark. Now, get cozy. The next tale is about to begin. I often wonder if you've ever truly experienced silence. Not the quiet of a suburban night or the hush of an empty flat. I mean proper, absolute silence. The kind that feels like a physical presence pressing against your eardrums. The kind that makes you doubt your own existence. I discovered that silence last summer in the boundary waters of northern Minnesota. And what I found lurking within it still visits me in dreams. The rain's been coming down like this for hours now, hasn't it? Just like it did that night. Funny how the sound of rainfall can bring memories rushing back with such clarity. It's almost as if time folds in on itself. Are you comfortable? Good. Pour yourself another cup of tea if you'd like. This might take a while. I've been planning the solo canoe trip for months. 6 days of paddling and portaging through Minnesota's pristine wilderness. Just myself and whatever I could fit in my waterproof packs. I'm an experienced outdoorsman, have been camping since I was a lad, but I'd never gone quite so far into isolation before. The Boundary Waters canoe area spans over 1 million acres along the Canadian border, with thousands of lakes and streams webbing through dense forests of pine and birch. Once you paddle beyond the entry points, you might not see another human for days. Perhaps that was the appeal. I'd gone through a particularly nasty divorce earlier that year, and the constant noise of London, the traffic, the neighbors, the endless notifications had become unbearable. I needed somewhere to reset, somewhere to remember who I was before everything fell apart. The first 3 days were glorious. Pristine waters reflecting skies, so blue they seemed artificial. Loons calling across misty mornings. Moose wading through shallow bays. I'd paddle from sunrise until mid-afternoon, then find a suitable island to make camp. I'd cook simple meals over my tiny camp stove, read until light faded, then fall asleep to the gentle lapping of waves against the shore. On the 4th day, the weather began to turn. Low clouds rolled in from the north, and the air felt charged, that distinctive heaviness that precedes a proper storm. I should have made camp early, but I was determined to reach Knife Lake by nightfall. It was supposed to be one of the most beautiful spots in the entire wilderness. The rain started gently enough around 4 in the afternoon, just a sprinkle at first, barely enough to warrant pulling out my rain jacket. But within an hour, it had become a steady downpour, reducing visibility to perhaps 50 meters. The wind picked up too, churning the lake's surface into choppy waves that slapped against my canoe. I spotted an island to the gray curtain of rain. Not large, but would do. I paddled hard against the increasingly angry waters, finally grinding the bow of my canoe onto a pebbled shore just as thunder rumbled overhead. Have you ever tried to set up a tent in driving rain? It's a miserable business. Everything gets wet no matter how carefully you work. By the time I had my shelter secure and my gear stowed inside, I was soaked through to the skin, shivering despite the summer temperatures. I changed into dry clothes, fired up my camp stove in the vestibule of the tent, and made a desperately needed cup of tea. The rain hammered against the tent fly with such force I could barely hear myself think. Lightning flashed, followed almost immediately by deafening thunder. The storm was directly overhead now. That's when I first noticed something odd about the thunder. After each crash, there seemed to be an echo, but not the rolling, diminishing echo you'd expect in a vast wilderness. This was different. A perfect replication of the original sound, just as loud, just as sharp, but delayed by perhaps 5 seconds. almost as if something was answering the thunder. I dismissed it as a trick of the terrain. Sound behaves strangely over water, especially in areas with cliffs or rock faces. I focus on my dinner, rehydrated pasta that tasted like heaven after a day of hard paddling, and tried to ignore how the thunder seemed to be engaged in conversation with itself. Night fell quickly under the storm clouds. With nothing else to do, I nestled into my sleeping bag around 8, hoping to read for a while before sleep. The rain continued its assault on my little shelter, but the thunder had moved on. The silence that followed felt oddly oppressive. I must have drifted off despite my unease, because I woke with a start sometime in the dead of night. The rain had softened to a gentle patter, and the wind had died completely. What had woken me? Then I heard it, the snap of a branch breaking somewhere on the island. I froze, straining my ears. It could be anything. A deer, a raccoon, perhaps even a moose. Another snap, closer this time, followed by what sounded disturbingly like footsteps on wet leaves. My heart began to pound. Bears are common in the Boundary Waters, and while black bears rarely attack humans, they're not above investigating campsites for food. Had I been careless with my dinner cleanup? I tried to remember if I'd packed away every scrap, every wrapper. The footsteps stopped, and for a long moment, there was nothing but the soft rain. Then, from much closer than I expected, perhaps only meters from my tent, came a sound that sent ice water coursing through my veins. A voice, a human voice, calling out a single word. Hello. I sat bolt upright, fumbling for my headlamp. Who could possibly be on this tiny island in the middle of nowhere during a storm at? I checked my watch. 2:17 a.m. Hello. I called back, my voice embarrassingly thin and tremulous. Who's there? 5 seconds passed. 10. Nothing but rain. Then, hello? Who's there? The exact same words I had just spoken, in a voice that sounded unnervingly like my own, but wrong somehow, as if someone had recorded me and played it back through damaged speakers. My mouth went dry. I'm a camper, I said, louder this time. Are you lost? Do you need help? The silence stretched for precisely 5 seconds. I'm a camper. Are you lost? Do you need help? The same words, the same intonation, but that distortion remained, like hearing your own voice on a recording and not quite recognizing it. I unzipped my sleeping bag and reached for my pocket knife. It wasn't much of a weapon, but it was all I had. This isn't funny, I said, trying to sound authoritative despite the tremor in my voice. Who are you? 5 seconds. This isn't funny. Who are you? I fumbled with the tent zipper, torn between the need to confront whatever was outside and the primal fear screaming at me to stay hidden. Before I could decide, another sound froze me in place. Scratching. Something was scratching at the fabric of my tent, moving slowly from one side to the other, not the casual brush of a branch, but deliberate, exploratory touches, as if whatever was out there was trying to understand what separated us. My breath came in short, sharp gasps. Sweat beaded on my forehead despite the cool night air. I clutched my pathetic knife and watched in horror as the rain-soaked fabric of my tent dimpled inward under an unseen pressure. Then the scratching stopped right by the entrance to my tent. I could see the silhouette of something through the thin material, a shadow darker than the night behind it. Not a bear. The proportions were all wrong. It seemed human-like, but somehow elongated, as if the dimensions weren't quite right. What do you want? I whispered, immediately regretting giving away that I was awake and aware. 5 seconds of silence. What do you want? came the whispered response. So close it could have been inside the tent with me. Something pressed against the zipper of my tent. Not trying to open it, just applying steady pressure. I could hear a strange, wet breathing from the other side of the thin barrier. In, out, rhythmic but somehow wrong, as if the lungs involved were too large, too inefficient. I was paralyzed with fear, clutching my knife so tightly my knuckles ached. The rational part of my brain had shut down entirely, leaving only the primitive core that recognized predator and prey. Then, abruptly, the pressure disappeared. The breathing stopped. For a wild moment, I thought whatever was had gone. "I can see you," said a voice directly above my tent. My head snapped up. Something was standing over my shelter, its weight causing the center pole to bow slightly. Rain drummed against what must have been its body, creating a different sound than the drops hitting my tent. I didn't respond. I couldn't. My throat had closed entirely. 5 seconds passed. "I can see you," the voice repeated from above, exactly as before. Then the true horror began. All around my tent, voices started to speak. Dozens of them, male and female, young and old, all with that same strange distortion. "Help me. Is anyone there? I'm hurt. Please, I'm lost. My children, I can't find my children. It's so cold out here." A cacophony of pleas and calls, each sounding like a damaged recording of real human distress. They overlapped, creating a nightmarish chorus that made it impossible to track any single voice. And beneath them all, something else, a low, rhythmic humming that seemed to vibrate to the ground and into my bones. I threw myself flat on the tent floor and covered my ears, but it did nothing to block the voices. If anything, they seemed to bypass my hearing entirely, materializing directly in my mind. Then, as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. Complete silence fell, broken only by the gentle patter of rain. I remained frozen, ears straining for any sound, for what felt like hours. Eventually, the gray light of dawn began to filter through the tent fabric. Birds started to call. Normal, natural bird songs. When I finally gathered the courage to unzip my tent and peer outside, the island appeared exactly as it had the evening before. No footprints in the mud, no broken branches, no sign anything had visited in the night. I broke camp in record time, my hands shaking so badly I could barely roll my sleeping bag. The entire time, I felt watched from tree line, though each time I jerked my head around, nothing was there, just dripping pines and morning mist rising from the wet ground. I paddled away from that island as it pursued, not stopping until my arms screamed with fatigue, and the island was far behind me. I made it back to the entry point a day early, fabricating a story about weather concerns for the outfitter who seemed surprised by my premature return. On the long drive back to Minneapolis, I tried to rationalize what had happened. Sleep paralysis, perhaps, or some kind of auditory hallucination brought on by isolation and stress. The mind can play cruel tricks when you're alone in the wilderness, but I know what I heard, and in the months since, I've done some research into the Boundary Waters region. It turns out there are stories, old stories from the Ojibwe people who lived there for centuries before Europeans arrived. Stories about something they called the Echo people, beings who could only speak what they had heard, who used the voices of the lost to lure the living deeper into the wilderness. The Ojibwe say they're not malevolent. Exactly. Just curious. They want to understand us, to learn what we are, but they don't understand human frailty. They don't understand that their curiosity can harm. I still go camping, still love the outdoors, But I never go alone anymore. And I never, ever answer when I hear a voice calling from the darkness. Do you hear that? The rain's picking up again. Sounds almost like whispers, doesn't it? Just the rain. Nothing more. Are you sure you're alone right now? Absolutely sure? Because sometimes I've found an echo doesn't need a sound to repeat. Sometimes it's already there, waiting, listening, learning. Sometimes it's right behind you, breathing so softly you must... Do you believe in hunger that never ends? The kind that transforms a person into something else? I didn't. Not until last autumn in the Boundary Waters. Listen to that rain outside. It's quite hypnotic, isn't it? Almost like that night in Minnesota, when everything changed for me. Make yourself comfortable. This isn't a story I tell often. I've always been what you might call an autumn enthusiast. There's something about those crisp mornings, the explosion of color in the trees, the sense of the world preparing for its long sleep. My mates back in Manchester think I'm balmy, flying all the way to America just to see some leaves change color. But they don't understand profound peace I find in those transitional landscapes. Last October, I planned what I thought would be the perfect wilderness experience. A week-long solo trek through the Boundary Waters canoe area in northern Minnesota. It's renowned for its autumn foliage. You see, miles upon miles of pristine lakes surrounded by maples and aspens blazing red and gold against the dark green pines. I'd spent months researching routes, gathering gear, and preparing myself physically for portages between lakes. I arrived at the outfitter's shop in Ely on a Tuesday morning. The weather forecast showed a cold front moving in by the weekend, but the chap behind the counter, Mike, I believe his name was, assured me it was nothing to worry about. Bit of rain, maybe some wind, he said, marking my intended route on a laminated map. You got good gear, right? Should be fine. Just be back by Sunday afternoon, when it might get properly nasty. Mike paused, studying me with a curious expression. You're heading into the Crooked Lake area? Pretty remote that time of year. Not many folks go that way once the weather turns. I explained that was precisely the appeal. Solitude, untouched wilderness, the chance to photograph landscapes few others would see. Fair enough, he replied, though something in his tone suggested reservation. Just stick to the marked trails and campsites. Some of those old logging paths can be mighty confusing when the leaves fall. I nodded, only half listening. I was eager to be on my way. The first 3 days were everything I'd hoped for. The lakes were like polished mirrors reflecting the kaleidoscope of autumn colors. I paddled from sunrise to mid-afternoon each day, stopping occasionally to hike inland and photograph particularly stunning vistas. In the evenings, I'd make camp at designated sites, cook a simple meal, and fall asleep to the gentle lapping of water against the shore and the distant hooting of owls. On the 4th day, I reached the northernmost point of my journey, a small, unnamed lake that wasn't frequented by many travelers. The campsite was overgrown, clearly in use for some time, but it had a certain wild charm to it. Ancient pines crowded close to the water's edge, their massive trunks creating natural windbreaks. A flat outcropping of granite made a perfect spot for my tent. As I was setting up camp, I noticed something odd. At the edge of the cleared area, partially hidden by undergrowth, stood a crude structure, a tripod of sticks lashed together, from which hung what looked like a small leather pouch. Native American, perhaps? I approached it cautiously, curious but respectful. The pouch was old, the leather cracked and discolored. I didn't open it. Something about it suggested it wasn't meant for casual inspection. Instead, I took a few photographs and resolved to ask about it when I returned to Ely. That evening, the weather began to shift. The temperature dropped dramatically as the sun set, and clouds rolled in, obscuring the stars. I added extra layers inside my sleeping bag and drifted off to the sound of wind rustling through the pines. I woke sometime in the blackest part of night to the sensation of being watched. Have you ever experienced that? The absolute certainty that eyes are fixed upon you, even when you can see no one. It's a primal feeling, something hardwired into our ancestral brains as a survival mechanism. I lay perfectly still, ears straining against the silence. The wind had died completely. No insects chirped. No night birds called. Just complete, oppressive silence. Then I heard it, a soft, rhythmic sound outside my tent. At first, I thought it might be an animal breathing, perhaps a deer or even a wolf that had wandered close to investigate the unfamiliar scent of human. But as I listened, I realized it wasn't breathing at all. It was chewing, slow, deliberate mastication, as if something was savoring each bite of whatever it was consuming. My blood ran cold. Bears are common in the Boundary Waters, and while they generally avoid humans, they're not above raiding campsites for food. Had I been careless with my dinner cleanup, I tried to remember if I'd hung my food pack properly from a tree branch, well away from my tent. The chewing continued, growing slightly louder. Then came another sound, the snap of bones breaking, followed by a wet, sliding noise that made my stomach turn. Something was eating, not trail mix or dehydrated camping meals, but meat, raw meat. I reached for my torch with trembling fingers, careful not to make a sound. Whatever was out there, I needed to see it to assess the threat. The beam of light cut through the darkness as I aimed it at the tent wall, and there, projected against the nylon fabric, was a silhouette, not a bear. The shape was vaguely humanoid, but grotesquely wrong in its proportions. Too tall, too thin, limbs like gnarled branches reaching impossible lengths. Its head appeared misshapen, elongated, with what looked like antlers or branches protruding from the crown. It was hunched over something on the ground, something that had once been alive. My breath caught in my throat. I accidentally shifted position, causing my sleeping bag to rustle faintly. The silhouette froze. Then, with a movement too fluid for any human, it straightened to its full height, easily 7 or 8 feet tall. Its head turned toward my tent, directly facing the... I switched off the light immediately, plunging myself back into darkness. My heart hammered so violently I feared the creature might hear it. For what felt like an eternity, nothing happened. No sound, no movement, just the weight of that presence outside. Listening, waiting, then came a voice, so close it might have been inside the tent with me. Hungry? The word was spoken in perfect English, but with a quality that defied description, like multiple voices layered over each other, some high and keening, others deep and guttural, all speaking in unison. I didn't respond. I couldn't. My throat had closed entirely. Always hungry, the voice continued, stretching the words as if they were unfamiliar shapes in its mouth. Something pressed against the side of my tent, not a hand or a paw, but something sharp that scraped along the fabric with a sound like nails on a chalkboard. You brought meat. The zipper of my tent began to move, slowly rising from the bottom. Pure animal panic seized me. I lunged for my pack, fumbling for anything that might serve as a weapon. My fingers closed around my cooking pot, a pathetic defense, but all I had. Cold air rushed in as the tent flap opened. I raised the pot, ready to strike, but what stood in the opening made my arm fall limply to my side. Nothing in my 53 years of life had prepared me for what I saw. My mind still struggles to assemble the details into a coherent whole. Its skin, if you could call it that, was like birch bark, pallid and peeling. The limbs were impossibly long and jointed in too many places. The face, God help me, the face was almost human. Almost, but stretched and distorted, with eyes like black pits and a mouth that split the lower half in a grin too wide, filled with teeth like yellowed needles. Antlers rose from its skull, not like a deer's, but twisted, broken things that seemed to be growing directly from the bone. It smiled at me, actually smiled, in a grotesque approximation of human expression. Wendigo. It said, tapping a twisted finger against its chest. Wendigo hungry. The word struck a chord in my memory. Wendigo, a creature from Algonquian folklore. A human transformed by greed and cannibalism into an ever-hungry monster. A cautionary tale I'd read about while researching the cultural history of the area. But cautionary tales aren't supposed to open your tent in the middle of the night. What happened next is fragmented in my memory. I remember screaming. I remember the creature's hand, cold as ice and strong as iron, closing around my wrist. I remember the cooking pot connecting with something solid, and a shriek that couldn't possibly have come from a human throat. I remember running, barefoot and half-dressed, through pitch-black forest, branches whipping my face, stones cutting my feet, but never stopping, never looking back. Somehow, I found my canoe. Somehow, I pushed it into the water and paddled with a desperate strength I didn't know I possessed. The rain had started by then, a cold, relentless downpour that made it nearly impossible to see. I paddled all night. When dawn finally broke, gray and cheerless through the rain, I had no idea where I was. Some lake, surrounded by dense forest that could have concealed anything. My map was back at the campsite, along with most of my gear. It took me 3 days to find my way back to civilization. 3 days of constant movement, minimal sleep, and jumping at every snap twig. 3 days of feeling watched from the tree line, of hearing that voice carried on the wind. Hungry, always hungry. When I finally staggered into a ranger station on the edge of the wilderness area, I was delirious with exhaustion and exposure. The rangers took one look at my condition and called for medical assistance. I told them I'd been spooked by a bear, that I'd panicked and gotten lost. It was easier than trying to explain what I'd actually seen. They nodded sympathetically, attributing my wild-eyed fear to hypothermia and exhaustion. One of them, an older man with Ojibwe features, regarded me with particular interest when I mentioned the location of my abandoned campsite. Old spirits in those woods, he said quietly, when the others were out of earshot. Hungry spirits. You're lucky to come back at all. He pressed something into my palm, a small leather pouch, similar to the one I'd seen hanging from the tripod. Protection, he said simply. Keep it with you. I've never returned to the Boundary Waters. Never gone camping alone again. The pouch hangs over my bed now, and sometimes in the darkest hours of night, I swear I can hear something scratching at my window, something that whispers in a voice like rustling leaves. Hungry, always hungry. So tell me, as the rain falls outside and the shadows lengthen in this room, are you hungry? Have you ever felt a hunger so deep it might consume your very soul? Because that's what waits in the deep woods of Boundary Waters. Not just a creature, but a hunger that infects, a hunger that transforms. I sometimes wonder if it followed me home, if part of it lives inside me now. Because since that night, I've felt it growing, an emptiness no amount of food can satisfy. And sometimes when I catch my reflection in the mirror, I could swear my teeth looked just a bit sharper than they used to be. Just a trick of the light. Surely, just like that shadow behind you is just a trick of the light, isn't it? The rain against your window reminds me of that sound. The constant patter on canvas, like fingernails gently tapping, asking to be let in. Are you comfortable? Good. Because once I start this story, I don't think I'll be able to stop until I've told it all. It's curious how certain memories remain so vivid, isn't it? While others fade like morning mist. The week I spent at Basswood Lake in the Boundary Waters 3 years ago, I remember every moment with painful clarity. Every sound, every smell, every inexplicable image. I'm a photographer by trade, specialize in wilderness landscapes for travel magazines and the like. Been doing it for nearly 2 decades now, and I've trekked through some of the most remote corners of the world. The Amazon, the Sahara, the Siberian taiga, but nowhere affected me like that pristine wilderness along the Minnesota-Canadian border. The assignment was straightforward. Capture the autumnal transformation of the Boundary Waters for an American Outdoors publication. 10 days, solo journey, minimal equipment. Just me, my cameras, and whatever I could fit in my canoe and backpack. I've always preferred working alone. There's a certain purity to experiencing wilderness in solitude. No chatter to break the natural silence. No competing visions to compromise your own artistic perspective. Just a landscape in your lens. Engaged in intimate conversation. My editor had arranged for an outfitter in Ely to provide the essentials: canoe, maps, camping gear. The fellow who helped me load up, an older chap named Hank with leathery skin and eyes that had seen far too much sun, seemed hesitant when I told him my planned route. Basswood's beautiful this time of year, he said, studying the map where I'd marked my intended campsites. But that eastern arm there, not many folks go that way anymore. That's precisely why I want to, I replied. Virgin territory, photographically speaking. He rubbed his chin thoughtfully. Just be careful around those old logging ruins. The foundations are unstable, and some of those mine shafts haven't been properly sealed. I'll keep my distance, I promised, though secretly I was delighted. Abandoned human structures reclaimed by nature are gold for photographers like me. The juxtaposition of man's temporary presence against nature's persistent return creates compelling visual narratives. The first 4 days were uneventful but spectacular. The autumn colors were at their peak, maples aflame with crimson and gold, set against the dark green of ancient pines and the clear blue of countless lakes. I paddled by day, capturing the changing light on water and woods, and camped each night on small islands where the loon's haunting calls echoed across the water. On the 5th day, I reached the eastern arm of Basswood Lake. The character of the wilderness changed subtly. The forest grew denser, darker, the trees more ancient and gnarled. Fewer signs of human passage were evident. No canoe-worn landing spots or cleared tent pads. Late that afternoon, I discovered the ruins Hank had mentioned. They emerged from the forest like the remnants of forgotten civilization. Crumbling stone foundations, rusted machinery half buried in moss, a partially collapsed chimney standing sentinel over what must have been a substantial operation in its day. I set up camp a respectful distance away, on a small promontory with good views of both the ruins and the lake. After securing my food pack against bears, always a concern in the Boundary Waters, I spent the golden hour photographing the site from various angles. The interplay of autumn light and shadow through the ruins created exactly the moody, mysterious atmosphere I'd hoped for. That night, a light rain began to fall as I retired to my tent. There's something deeply comforting about being warm and dry while listening to rainfall on canvas. I fell asleep reviewing the day's images on my camera's small screen, pleased with what I captured. I woke abruptly at 3:17 a.m. I know the exact time because I checked my watch immediately, disturbed by what pulled me from sleep, the distinct sound of footsteps moving through my campsite. Heavy, deliberate steps. Too heavy for any woodland creature. Too deliberate for someone trying to move stealthily. I lay perfectly still, barely breathing, listening as they circled my tent once, twice, before stopping directly outside the entrance. My headlamp was within reach. But something primal warned me against turning it on, against acknowledging whatever waited in the darkness. The rain had intensified, drumming steadily against the fly. Through it, I heard what sounded like breathing, deep labored, as if from lungs unaccustomed to use. Then, a smell seeped through the thin nylon walls. Not the earthy scent of wet forest or the musky odor of a curious animal. This was chemical, acrid, like old film developing solution, and sulfur, and something else I couldn't identify, but that made my throat constrict involuntarily. Hello? I finally managed, my voice embarrassingly thin. Is someone there? No response. Just that labored breathing and the intensifying chemical smell. Something brushed against the tent fabric. Not the casual swipe of a branch in the wind, but a deliberate touch that moved slowly from one side to the other, as if examining the structure. I reached for my pocket knife, the only potential weapon I had. I know you're there, I said, attempting to sound authoritative despite my racing heart. What do you want? The touching stopped. The breathing ceased. For a long moment, there was nothing but the rain. Then a voice spoke. So close it might have been inside the tent with me. Come see. The words were perfectly clear despite the rainfall. The voice was neither male nor female, neither young nor old. It possessed a flat, affectless quality that raised the hair on my arms. What? I stammered. See what? The pictures. Come see the pictures. My blood turned to ice water. I'd told no one about being a photographer. Hadn't spoken to another soul since leaving Ely 5 days earlier. What pictures? I whispered. The ones you haven't taken yet. Something pressed against the tent zipper. Not trying to open it, just applying steady pressure. I clutched my knife tighter, though I knew it would be useless against whatever was outside. Then, suddenly, the presence was gone. The chemical smell dissipated. The rain continued its steady patter on the tent fly, now sounding almost mocking in its normalcy. I didn't sleep again that night. When dawn finally broke, gray and misty through persistent drizzle, I cautiously unzipped my tent and peered out. The campsite appeared undisturbed. No footprints in the muddy ground. No sign anyone or anything had visited in the night. Had I dreamed it? A nightmare born of isolation and an unfamiliar environment? I would have dismissed it as such if not for one detail. My camera, which I distinctly remember placing beside my sleeping pad before falling asleep, was now sitting outside the tent, carefully positioned on a flat rock and partially protected from the rain by an overhanging branch. And it was on, the power light, glowing green, in the gray morning light. With trembling fingers, I picked it up and checked the display. New images have been added to the memory card. 27 of them, according to the file count. Images I had no memory of taking. I began scrolling through them, and my confusion transformed into crawling horror. They were photographs of me, asleep in my tent. The first few showed me from outside, my silhouette visible through the tent fabric. then progressively closer perspectives, somehow taken from inside the tent. Looking down at my sleeping form, the final image was a close-up of my face, eyes closed, utterly vulnerable. But that was impossible. The camera had been beside me all night, and there was no sign of the tent being disturbed or entered. My hands shook so badly I nearly dropped the camera. Fight or flight instinct screamed at me to pack up and flee, to paddle until my arms gave out, to put as much distance as possible between myself and this place. But professional curiosity, the curse of every journalist, held me in place. I had to know what else the camera had captured. I continued scrolling through the images, now moving into ones I hadn't seen yet. What I found defies rational explanation. They were photographs of the ruins, but not as they appeared now. In these images, the buildings were intact. A large main structure with a tall chimney, several smaller outbuildings, equipment, and vehicles from what appeared to be the 1930s or 40s. Men in period work clothes stood in various poses around the site. Some looked directly at the camera, their expressions grim and knowing. The final 3 images turned my blood to ice. They show what appeared to be the interior of a mine shaft or tunnel. Dark, rough-hewn walls, crude wooden support beams, and in the deepest recess, illuminated by what must have been a powerful flash, was a cavern containing something. The image was slightly blurred, as if the photographer's hand had trembled at the moment of exposure. But I could make out enough. A towering, vaguely humanoid shape composed of jointed segments that reflected light in a way organic material shouldn't. Around were scattered human forms, prostrate, as if in worship or supplication. I deleted the images immediately, all of them, then formatted the memory card for good measure. My hands wouldn't stop shaking. I broke camp in record time, throwing gear haphazardly into my packs, desperate to be away from that place before the gray daylight failed. As I pushed my canoe into the water, I glanced back at the ruins one last time. A figure stood among the crumbling stones, tall, motionless, watching, too distant to make out clearly through the rain, but undeniably present. I paddled harder than I ever have in my life, not stopping until my arms felt like lead and my campsite was miles behind me. That night, I made camp on a small island in the middle of the lake, reasoning that whatever had visited me would have difficulty approaching without being heard. Still, I didn't sleep, couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those images, the intact ruins, the grim-faced workers, the thing in the mine shaft. The next morning, I abandoned my assignment and headed back toward the entry point, pushing myself to cover in 2 days what had taken me 5 on the way in. When I finally reached Ely, I must have looked a sight, unshaven, wild-eyed, clothes stinking of sweat and fear. Hank was at the outfitters when I returned the gear. He took one look at me and led me to a quiet back office, away from the curious stares of other customers. "You went to the old Basswood Mine site, didn't you?" he asked quietly. I nodded, unable to form words. He sighed heavily. "Thought so. Few people who camp there come back, unchanged." "What is that place?" I finally managed. "Officially, an abandoned logging and mining operation from the 1920s. Unofficially," he paused, lowering his voice further, "the old-timers say they found something in those tunnels. Something that wasn't meant to be disturbed. Something that takes interest in visitors. Takes pictures of them, you mean?" The words tumbled out before I could stop them. Hank's eyes widened slightly. "So it showed you did it? The images? How did you know?" "It's what it does. Shows different things to different people. Things that were things that will be. He shook his head slowly. My grandfather worked those mines. Was there the day they broke through into that lower chamber. Only 3 men came back out. They sealed it up, abandoned the whole operation. But some things can't be contained by timber and stone. I left Ely that same day, driving straight to Minneapolis and catching the first flight back to London. I never submitted any photographs from the Boundary Waters. Told my editor I'd had equipment failure due to rain. He was understanding, if disappointed. For months afterward, I checked my camera obsessively, half expecting to find new images mysteriously added to the memory card. Nothing ever appeared. Eventually, I sold that camera and bought a new one. Unable to look at it without remembering, I continued my work, continued traveling to remote places, but never alone, and never again to the Boundary Waters. There's one detail I haven't shared with anyone until now, something I discovered only after returning home and reviewing the few legitimate photographs I'd taken before that night. In every single image of the ruins, partially hidden among the stones or appearing from behind trees, is a figure, indistinct, easily mistaken for a shadow or vegetation, unless you know exactly what to look for, but unmistakably present, watching, and sometimes still, I wake in the night to the sound of rainfall and the faint smell of chemicals. My camera, which I always carefully place on my desk before sleeping, has moved to my bedside table, the power light glowing softly in the darkness. I don't check it anymore. I don't want to see what images it might contain. Do you hear the rain picking up outside? Listen closely, beyond the rhythmic pattern. Can you hear something else? Something that sounds almost like footsteps? Would you like to see? I have my camera right here. There are pictures you haven't taken yet. The rain's quite heavy tonight, isn't it? Rather like that week in the Boundary Waters. The sound brings it all back. Water drumming against fabric, dripping from pine needles, rippling across the surface of a lake that shouldn't exist. Would you mind if I turn on another light? The shadows in here, they remind me of things I'd rather not recall. I've been an anthropologist for nearly 30 years. My specialty is indigenous folklore, the stories cultures tell themselves to explain the inexplicable. I've documented creation myths in the Amazon, collected ghost stories in rural Japan, and recorded shamanic rituals in Mongolia. In all those years, I prided myself on maintaining scientific detachment. These were fascinating cultural artifacts, nothing more. I no longer possessed that certainty. It was late September, 2 years ago. I'd arranged a solo canoe trip through Minnesota's Boundary Waters to research Ojibwe legends associated with specific locations in the wilderness area. My particular interest was in stories tied to Knife Lake, a massive, sprawling body of water near the Canadian border that features prominently in local mythology. The Ojibwe speak of it as a place where the boundary between worlds grows thin, especially during the autumn equinox. A place where the mist that rises from the water isn't merely water vapor, but the breath of beings that dwell in the space between waking and dreaming. Quaint local color, I thought. Perfect material for the comparative mythology text I was writing. I set out from Fall Lake on a crisp, clear morning. The autumn colors were reaching their peak. Maples blazing scarlet against the dark green of pines. Aspen leaves shimmering gold in the breeze. I planned a 6-day circuit, with 2 full days to explore the shores of Knife Lake before looping back to my starting point. The outfitter who provided my canoe, a weathered chap called Ray with deeply etched lines around his eyes, seemed oddly hesitant when I explained my destination and purpose. Knife Lake's a strange place that time of year, he said, studying me with an intensity that made me slightly uncomfortable, especially for someone traveling alone. I assured him I was an experienced outdoorsman, well prepared for whatever weather might develop. He nodded, but his expression remained troubled. "It's not the weather I'm concerned about," he said quietly. "Just, if the mist comes, stay on the water. Don't make for shore, no matter what you think you see or hear. The lake's safer than what waits in the trees." I laughed politely, thinking he was having a bit of fun with the academic from London. "I'll keep that in mind," I promised, not taking his warning seriously. The first 3 days were glorious. Perfect autumn weather, breathtaking scenery, and blessed solitude. I paddled from sunrise until mid-afternoon each day, then made camp on small islands or secluded bays. In the evenings, I'd review my notes on local legends, occasionally recorded my thoughts on a small digital recorder I brought along. On the 4th day, I reached Knife Lake. It was larger and more impressive than maps had suggested, stretching beyond the horizon, its waters dark and profound despite their clarity. Rocky cliffs lined portions of the shoreline, dropping straight into depths rumored to exceed 300 feet in places. I made camp on a small, pine-covered island near the eastern arm of the lake. The site was perfect, a natural clearing surrounded by ancient red pines, with a granite outcropping that provided an excellent view of the surrounding waters. After setting up my tent and securing my food pack against bears, I sat on the warm stone and watched the setting sun paint the lake in hues of gold and amber. As twilight deepened, an unusual phenomenon began to unfold. Mist, thin tendrils at first, then thicker columns, rose from the lake's surface, not just in one area, but everywhere, as if the water itself were transforming into vapor before my eyes. Within 20 minutes, the entire lake had disappeared beneath a blanket of fog so dense I could barely see 10 meters in any direction. I'd read about this. Local guides called it the smoking water, but seeing it firsthand was mesmerizing. I recorded several minutes of video on my phone, narrating my observations for later reference. As darkness fell completely, the mist continued to thicken, the temperature dropped precipitously, and I retreated to my tent earlier than usual, zipping myself into my sleeping bag with a book and headlamp for company. I must have dozed off while reading, because I woke suddenly to complete darkness. My headlamp had switched off, battery failure, I presumed, and the night was utterly silent. No lapping of waves against the shore, no rustling of wind through pine needles, not even the call of a distant loon, just profound, unnatural silence, until I heard the singing. It came from somewhere on the lake, a woman's voice, ethereal and haunting, in a language I didn't recognize, but that stirred something deep and primal within me. The melody was simple yet somehow complex, folding it on itself in ways that seemed to defy the limitations of a single human voice. I fumbled for my phone, thinking to record this unexpected gift for my research, but the device was dead, fully charged when I'd used it just hours earlier, now completely unresponsive. The singing continued, growing neither louder nor softer, maintaining the same distance regardless of how intently I listened. After several minutes, I gave in to curiosity, pulling on boots and jacket. I unzipped my tent and stepped into the mist-shrouded night. The fog had thickened to an almost solid presence, swirling around my body as if curious about this intruder. I couldn't see the lake, though I knew it was mere meters away. Couldn't see the surrounding trees, just endless, luminous white that seemed to absorb the beam of my torch rather than be penetrated by it. The singing came from directly ahead, from what should have been the middle of the lake. Impossible, I told myself. No one would be out on the water in such conditions. And yet, the voice continued, now interspersed with what sounded like soft laughter. I thought of Ray's warning. If the mist comes, stay on the water. But surely he'd meant while canoeing, not while safely. I took a cautious step toward the lake, then another. My torch beam disappeared into the wall of white, just beyond arm's reach. The singing seemed to respond to my movement, taking on an inviting quality, beckoning me forward. At the water's edge, I hesitated. The mist was so thick I couldn't see the lake at all, though I could hear gentle wavelets lapping against the rocks at my feet. The singing now seemed to come from just meters away, as if the performer stood on the water itself. "Hello," I called, feeling slightly foolish. "Is someone there?" The singing stopped abruptly. The silence that followed felt expectant, charged with potential. Then a voice spoke, not in song now, but in perfect, accentless English. "Professor Campbell, we've been waiting for you." My blood ran cold. I had told no one my name or profession besides Ray the Outfitter and the permit office in Ely. No one could possibly know who I was, alone on this island in the darkness. "Who's there?" I demanded. Try and keep the tremor from my voice. Soft laughter echoed across the hidden water. "The better question is what's here, Professor? You've studied us for so long. Don't you want to meet us at last?" The mist parted slightly, revealing a figure standing, no, floating, just above the lake's surface about 5 meters from shore. The form was humanoid but indistinct, its edges blurring into surrounding fog as it were composed of the same substance. Where a face should have been, only darkness gazed back at me. I stumbled backward, nearly falling on the slick rocks. This was impossible. A hallucination. Perhaps I'd eaten something toxic, or the isolation was affecting my mind more than I'd realized. "Don't be afraid," the figure said, its voice now directly in my ear despite remaining physically distant. "We only want to show you. The stories you collected, they're all true. Every culture sees us through its own lens, gives us different names, different forms, but we've always been here in the spaces between certainties." The mist swirled violently, and suddenly the figure was gone. In its place stood something else, a towering shape with too many limbs, its body seeming to fold through dimensions that shouldn't exist. It shifted and changed as I watched, cycling through forms I recognized from a dozen different mythologies. The Wendigo of the Algonquian peoples, the Naki of Finnish lore, the Kappa of Japan, each manifestation lasting just long enough to register before morphing into the next. "Stop," I whispered, unable to process what I was seeing. "Please stop." The shifting ceased, and the figure returned to its misty, humanoid form. "But this is what you wanted, Professor. Evidence, confirmation, the truth behind the stories." I can't. Words fail me completely. "You can't accept what you're seeing," the voice finished for me. "Even when confronted with direct evidence, your mind rebels. So typical of your kind, you pursue knowledge until it threatens your comfortable certainties, then retreat into denial. Despite my terror, the academic in me couldn't help responding to this accusation. That's not fair. I've dedicated my life to understanding. Understanding. The figure drifted closer, now hovering just above the water at the shoreline. "You've collected our stories like butterflies to be pinned in display cases, classified, categorized, and dismissed as cultural artifacts, never once considering we might be listening when you speak our names, watching when you enter our domains." The mist thickened around me, cutting visibility to almost nothing. I could feel it brushing against my skin like cold, damp fingers. We've been patient, Professor. So patient. Watching you paddle across our waters, camp on our islands, record your clever little theories and your clever little devices. Something touched the back of my neck, a sensation like wet silk drawn slowly across my skin. I spun around, but there was nothing there, just endless white in all directions. What you want from me? I managed, my voice barely audible. Want? The words seemed to come from everywhere at once. We want what we've always wanted from your kind. Acknowledgement, respect, and occasionally, when the conditions are right, participation. The mist began to coalesce, forming dozens of humanoid shapes surrounding me in a loose circle, some tall and thin, others squat and hulking, none entirely solid, none entirely transparent, all watching with faces that weren't faces. The stories got that part wrong. The original voice continued conversationally. We rarely consume human flesh. What sustains us is far less tangible. Experience, emotion, belief. One of the figures moved forward. An approximation of a woman, her form suggested rather than defined by the swirling vapor. You record our stories, she said, her voice like wind through cattails. Now we would record yours. She extended what might have been a hand, and it was my digital recorder, the one I'd left safely in my tent. A trade, Professor. Your story for safe passage from our waters. Speak it truly, and you may leave when the mist retreats with the dawn. My academic mind, the part trained to observe and analyze even in the most extreme circumstances, noted the classic structure of this encounter, the supernatural bargain, the challenge that must be met before release. Ancient narrative patterns playing out with me as the unwitting protagonist. What story? I asked, resigned now participating in this impossible scenario. Your fear. Another voice whispered from behind me. Speak your deepest fear into the recorder. Such a simple request. I'd faced down armed rebels in Colombia, been trapped in a cave collapse in Turkey, nearly drowned in a flash flood in Arizona. I knew fear intimately, but as I stood there, surrounded by these ancient intelligences wearing bodies of mist, I realized what truly terrified me wasn't death or pain, or even the unknown. It was insignificance. I took the record. My name is Dr. James Campbell. I began, my voice steadier than I expected, and I am afraid that none of this matters. My research, my publications, my entire career, just footnotes that will be forgotten within a generation. I've spent my life studying how other cultures process the inexplicable, but I've never truly faced it myself. I've hidden behind academic detachment, afraid to admit that maybe, just maybe, there are things in this world that can't be categorized or explained. And now, confronted with that reality, I find I am unmade by it. I stop, emotion choking off further words. The recorder continued to run, capturing nothing but the sound of my ragged breathing. The mist woman took back the device, her touch cold and somehow viscous against my skin. Well spoken, Professor, she said, her voice now gentle. Truth for truth. We're the stories that outlast their tellers, the fears that transcend culture and time. As long as humans whisper tales around campfires or huddle together against the unknown dark, we endure. The circle of figures began to dissolve, merging back into the formless mist. Dawn approaches, the voice said, now sounding distant. When the sun burns away this veil, you will find your way back to familiar shores. But remember, Professor, You carry a piece of us with you now. In quiet moments, when fog rolls across a city street or mist rises from a garden pond. Listen carefully. We may have more to teach you. I must have lost consciousness then, because the next thing I remember is waking to brilliant sunshine on my face. I was lying on the rocky shore of my island, clothes soaked with dew, my digital recorder clutched in one hand. The lake stretched before me, crystal clear and ordinary in the morning light. No sign of mist, no evidence of the impossible encounter that still blazed in my memory. I told myself it had been a dream, a vivid hallucination brought on by isolation, and perhaps mild hypothermia from wandering in the fog. I almost convinced myself, until I played back the recording. My voice came through clearly at first, exactly the confession I remembered making. But as the recording continued past where I'd stopped speaking, other voices became audible, whispering in languages I recognized from my studies, and many I didn't. Hundreds of voices layered over each other, speaking what seemed to be the same phrases in different tongues. The final voice, rising above the others with perfect clarity, spoke in English. "We are patient, Professor. We have always been patient." I left Knife Lake that same day, abandoning my research plans and paddling with frantic energy back toward civilization. When I reached the outfitter's shop in Ely, Ray took one look at my face and nodded slowly. "You saw them," he said. Not a question. I couldn't bring myself to speak of it directly. "The miss I managed on Knife Lake." He nodded again. "My grandfather was Ojibwe. He used to say the Mist people were the original keepers of stories, that they collected them like precious gems, and sometimes, if the story was worthy, they'd trade their own in return." "Trade," I repeated numbly. "Did they give you something, Professor?" Ray asked, his eyes sharp and knowing. I thought of the recording, which I had played a dozen times during my journey back, each time hearing different voices, different languages. "Understanding," I said finally. "They gave me understanding." I never published my book on comparative mythology. How could I, knowing what I now knew? Instead, I took early retirement from the university and moved to a small cottage on the Scottish coast, where mist rolls in from the North Sea with predictable regularity. On foggy nights, I sit on my porch and listen. Sometimes, I speak into the mist, not research notes or academic observations, but personal stories, fears, hopes, confessions, and sometimes when conditions are just right, the mist speaks back. "The rain's easing now, isn't it? But look there, at your window. See how the droplets have formed a fine mist on the glass? Almost like faces, wouldn't you say? Perhaps you have a story you'd like to share? They're listening, you know, they're always listening." That rain against your window, it sounds like whispers, doesn't it? Like someone trying to tell you something important, just below the threshold of understanding. Are you sitting comfortably? Good. I don't tell this story often. Most people wouldn't believe it anyway. But there's something in your eyes that tells me you might. I'm a physicist, or was before that week in the Boundary Waters changed everything. I specialize in atmospheric phenomena, particularly the aurora borealis. Spent 15 years developing instruments to measure the electromagnetic fluctuations that create those spectacular light shows. Published in all the right journals. Tenured at Cambridge. The very model of a proper British scientist. Rational to my core, or so I believed. 3 years ago, I took a sabbatical to conduct field research in northern Minnesota. The Boundary Waters Canoe Area stretches along the Canadian border. a vast wilderness of interconnected lakes and ancient forests where light pollution is practically non-existent, perfect for studying the aurora during the autumn equinox, when geomagnetic activity tends to peak. I'd arrange for a guide, standard procedure when deploying sensitive equipment in remote locations. But a family emergency forced him to cancel 2 days before our departure. Rather than postpone months of planning, I decided to go alone. I'd done enough wilderness trekking in the Scottish Highlands to feel confident in my abilities, and my route was straightforward. Paddle north through a series of lakes to Saginaga, set up my instruments on the most isolated island I could find, and collect data for 5 nights before returning. The outfitter in Ely seemed skeptical when I explained my revised plan. Saginaga in September solo? He studied me over reading glasses perched low on his nose. That's big water up there, but it can change mighty quick this time of year. I've checked the forecast, I assured him. Clear skies predicted all week. Perfect for my research. He nodded slowly. Weather ain't my primary concern. That close to the border, that time of year, strange things happen on Saginaga, especially during the lights. I smiled politely, accustomed to locals embellishing their wilderness with superstition. Good for tourism, I suppose. I'll be careful, I promised, not taking his warning seriously. See that you are. He handed me my permit. And if the lights start looking unusual, maybe turn off your fancy equipment and just watch natural light. Some things shouldn't be measured. I thanked him for the advice I had no intention of following and began my journey north. The first 3 days were glorious. Perfect autumn weather, breathtaking scenery, and minimal exertion thanks to my carefully planned route. I paddled by day, camping on small islands where the only sounds were wind through pine needles and loons calling across the water. My evening ritual was to check my meteorological instruments, update my journal, and gaze at stars impossibly bright in the unpolluted sky. No aurora yet, but my satellite phone showed heightened solar activity. It was only a matter of time. On the 4th day, I reached Saginaga, an enormous lake straddling the U.S.-Canadian border, dotted with islands of varying sizes. I selected one near the middle, far from any possible human interference. It was perhaps 3 acres in total, with a perfect clearing on its northern shore where I could set my equipment with an unobstructed view of the sky. After establishing camp, I assembled my instruments, a magnetometer to measure geomagnetic fluctuations, a spectrometer to analyze light wavelengths, and a high-sensitivity camera with specialized filters. All were connected to a small field computer that would record data continuously throughout the night. Standard equipment for aurora research, though my particular configuration was unique, designed to capture subtle phenomena most instruments missed. As the sun set, I felt a familiar thrill of anticipation. The forecast showed a 70% chance of aurora activity that night, the highest of my scheduled stay. Perfect timing. Twilight deepened into true darkness. The stars emerged, so numerous and brilliant they seemed almost three-dimensional. I checked my instruments one final time, then settled back in my camp chair with a thermos of tea, eyes fixed on the northern horizon. The aurora began subtly, just a faint green glow at first, like a distant city's light pollution. But it quickly intensified, shimmering curtains of emerald and chartreuse undulating across the sky. Classic Type B aurora, precisely what I'd hoped to observe. My instruments hummed quietly, recording every fluctuation in the electromagnetic field, every shift in spectral intensity. I made occasional notes in my journal, but mostly I simply watched, professional detachment gradually giving way to the simple human all these lights have inspired for millennia. Around midnight, the display intensified dramatically. The green curtains were joined by pulsing ribbons of purple and blue, dancing across the stars with increased velocity. Unusual but not unprecedented. My equipment recorded everything. Sensors capturing data far beyond what the human eye could perceive. Then the lights changed. It happened so gradually I didn't immediately register the shift. The patterns became more structured, less random. The curtains and ribbons began to form distinct shapes, holding them briefly before dissolving back into chaos. I blinked, wondering if my eyes were playing tricks after hours of observation. But no, there was again a perfect circle of blue light, surrounded by radiating lines of green, like a child's drawing of the sun. It held its shape for perhaps 5 seconds before shattering into normal aurora patterns. Fascinating. I'd read theoretical papers suggesting that certain geomagnetic conditions could create momentary geometric patterns in auroral displays, but I'd never witnessed it personally. I checked my instruments, all functioning perfectly, capturing what might be groundbreaking data. The geometric shapes continued to appear and dissolve with increasing frequency. Circles, triangles, spirals, then more complex forms I couldn't readily classify. Some resembled mathematical symbols. Others reminded me of ancient petroglyphs I'd seen in archaeology textbooks. And they were getting larger, more distinct, more deliberate. A chill ran down my spine that had nothing to do with the September night. These weren't random electromagnetic phenomena. They couldn't be. The patterns were too precise, too consistent, almost like language. The thought formed unbidden, and once it surfaced, I couldn't dismiss it. I was watching someone communicate through manipulations of the aurora itself. Preposterous, of course. The rational part of my brain rejected the notion immediately. Aurora are created by solar particles interacting with Earth's magnetic field. Natural phenomena, measurable, explicable. Yet as I watched a perfect Fibonacci spiral bloom across a quarter of the visible sky, I couldn't help but wonder. My field computer chimed softly, an alert I programmed to signal unusual readings. I tore my gaze from the sky long enough to check the screen, and what I saw made no scientific sense. The magnetometer showed massive localized fluctuations in the electromagnetic field, far beyond what the visible aurora should generate. The spectrometer was detecting wavelengths of light that shouldn't exist in an aurora, including some beyond the normal visible spectrum. And the temperature around my instruments had dropped nearly 20 degrees in the span of minutes, despite no perceptible change in the ambient air. I looked back at the sky, scientific certainty crumbling beneath the weight of impossible evidence. The entire northern sky was now filled with light. Not the dancing veils of typical aurora, but structured geometric patterns shifting and flowing with mathematical precision. Circles nested within circles. Triangles transforming into hexagons, then spirals, then shapes I had no names for. And they were moving, not just across the sky, but downward, descending toward the lake, toward my island. The rational explanation, the one I desperately clung to, was that I was witnessing some unknown atmospheric phenomenon, perhaps linked to unusual solar activity. Something rare but natural. Something that would make my career when I published the data. But as the lights continued their impossible descent, another explanation pressed against my consciousness. What if the aurora wasn't just an effect of solar particles? What if it had always been something else entirely? Something using those interactions as a medium. The way we use sound waves to carry our voices, the nearest pattern, a pulsing blue spiral, was now so closely reflected off the lake's surface, creating a perfect mirror image on the obsidian water. The air hummed with energy I could feel in my teeth, in the roots of my hair. My instruments were registering values that should have been physically impossible, their displays flickering with the strain of recording the unrecordable. Then I heard it, felt it in my head. Not a voice, exactly. More like concepts impressing themselves directly into my consciousness. bypassing the clumsy medium language. Observer, you measure, you record, you seek to understand. I couldn't move, couldn't speak. Whether from fear or something else, I was frozen in place, watching as the lights descended to just above the lake's surface, perhaps 30 meters from shore. They coalesced into a rough column of pulsing, shifting light that contained all the geometric patterns I'd observed, now cycling through them in hypnotic sequences. We have observed your observations, measurements of measurements, recursion. Interesting. What were you? I managed, my voice thin and strange to my own ears. The column of light pulsed, patterns accelerating momentarily. We are ancient. We were here when your kind huddled in caves, gazing upward. We watched you create myths to explain us. Gods, spirits, signs and portents. Now you bring instruments, equations, new myths. The implications were staggering. An intelligent entity or entities that had existed alongside humanity for millennia, observing as we tried to explain the aurora through successive frameworks of understanding, mythology, religion, science, all equally inadequate approximations of something far beyond human comprehension. What do you want? I whispered. Want is a biological concept. Need born from lack. We do not want. We observe. We exist. Sometimes, when conditions align, we communicate. Why now? Why me? The light column rippled, patterns shifting to configurations that somehow conveyed amusement. Your instruments, different. They perceive beyond the limitations of your biological sensors. They noticed us noticing you, a rare recognition. My equipment, my specialized aurora detection system, designed to capture subtle phenomena that standard instruments missed. Somehow, it had accidentally detected evidence of intelligence within the aurora, and that intelligence had noticed being noticed. The column moved closer to shore, now perhaps only 10 meters away. The air crackled with energy, raising the hair on my arms. My computer emitted a high-pitched whine, as its sensors were overwhelmed by readings they weren't designed to process. We would exchange observations. You have studied us through your instruments. We would study you directly. A tendril of light extended from the column, reaching toward me like a curious finger. Every scientific instinct told me to run, to put distance between myself and this impossible phenomenon. But a deeper instinct, the same human curiosity that had driven me to study the stars in the first place, kept me rooted in place. The tendril touched my forehead. What followed defies description in conventional language. It wasn't painful, but neither was it pleasant. Imagine every neuron in your brain firing simultaneously, each one revealing a memory, a concept, a fragment of your identity. Imagine your entire life experience compressed into a single, eternal moment of perfect self-knowledge. I perceive my own consciousness as a physical structure, a lattice of light and energy not unlike the aurora itself. I watched as these entities, moved through that structure, examining each node in connection with cool, dispassionate interest, intricate, limited, beautiful in constraints. You perceive linearly, process sequentially. Still, you reach beyond your design. Commendable. The entities weren't complimenting me personally. I realized they were expressing something like aesthetic appreciation for the human mind itself, for what it managed to accomplish despite its limits. Just as abruptly as it had begun, the examination ended. The tendril of light withdrew, leaving me gasping in my camp chair, shaking uncontrollably but somehow unharmed. Exchange completed. Your measurements remain. Ours return with us. The column began to rise, the geometric patterns shifting more rapidly now, some collapsing into others, complexity yielding to simplicity as the entity prepared to return to its natural domain. Wait, I called. surprised by my own boldness. Will I see you again? The column paused, hovering just above the water. Conditions align rarely, but you know now how to look beyond the veil of your perceptions. Whether this knowledge serves or harms remains to be observed. With that enigmatic response, the entity ascended rapidly, the structured patterns dissolving back into more familiar undulating curtains of the aurora borealis. Within minutes, the display had returned to normal, beautiful but apparently natural, showing no sign of the intelligence that had briefly revealed itself. I sat motionless until dawn, watching the sky, hoping for some further communication. None came. When the sun finally rose, I felt simultaneously exhausted and electrified. My understanding of reality fundamentally altered. My instruments had continued recording throughout the encounter. When I checked the data, I expected to find evidence of the impossible event, the structured patterns, the anomalous readings, proof I could take back to my colleagues. The files were there, but corrupted beyond recovery. Random strings of meaningless characters. Static, where there should have been spectral analysis. My camera had captured nothing but normal aurora activity, with no hint of the geometric patterns or the column of light. No proof. Nothing to validate what I'd experienced except my own memories. I abandoned my research plan and returned to Ely the next day. The outfitter noted my early return but asked no questions, merely nodding when I mentioned I'd seen unusual aurora activity on Saginaga. Told you, he said simply. Some things shouldn't be measured. I never published my findings from that trip. How could I? Aurora contains intelligent entities. Isn't the sort of claim that advances one's scientific career, especially without evidence. I completed my sabbatical with unrelated research and returned to Cambridge, outwardly unchanged. But everything was different. My focus shifted from measuring atmospheric phenomena to theoretical work on consciousness itself, specifically non-biological forms of intelligence that might exist beyond human perception. My colleagues attributed this new direction to mid-career restlessness. They couldn't know the truth. I returned to Boundary Waters each September since then, always alone, always to Saginaga. I bring no instruments, no measuring devices, just myself, open to whatever communication might come through the dancing lights. So far, the aurora has remained simply aurora, beautiful but apparently natural. Yet sometimes, when the lights are particularly active, I perceive hints of structure within the chaos, whispers of pattern that might be coincidence or might be something more. And in those moments, I know I'm being observed just as carefully as I'm observing. Measurements of measurements. Recursion. Interesting. Listen, the rain has stopped. But the clouds, do you see that faint glow on the horizon? Green, with perhaps a hint of blue? The forecast didn't mention aurora activity tonight. Then again, some phenomena exist beyond our ability to predict, beyond our frameworks of understanding. Would you like to step outside, to look beyond the veil of perception? They might be watching. They might have something to show you. Just remember, once you've seen them, they've also seen you, and neither of you will ever be quite the same again. Do you hear how the rain has changed its rhythm? Listen closely. There's a pattern to it now, almost like a code being tapped against the glass, like someone trying to get your attention. You might want to draw the curtains. Some things are better left unobserved, especially on nights like this. I used to be a hydrologist, studied water systems for 30 years. Rivers, lakes, aquifers, glaciers, the movement and properties of Earth's most common compound. Most people think water is simple, transparent, predictable, but those of us who spend our lives observing it know better. Water remembers, water preserves, water waits. I learned that lesson 5 years ago in the boundary waters of northern Minnesota. I was there conducting research on abnormal thermal stratification in deep northern lakes. Climate change has altered water temperature patterns worldwide, and I was gathering data to refine predictive models. Lac La Croix, straddling the U.S.-Canadian border, was of particular interest due to its unusual depth profiles and relative isolation from human interference. It was late September, perfect timing, as the lake will be completing its annual temperature cycle, with the thermocline migrating deeper as surface waters cool. My plan was simple. 10 days of collecting samples and measurements from various depths, then back to civilization to analyze the results. I'd hired a local guide, standard procedure for research in remote areas, but he fell ill 2 days before departure. Rather than postpone months of planning, I decided to go alone. I'd spent enough time in wilderness settings to feel confident in my abilities, and my equipment was relatively lightweight. Temperature probes, water sampling devices, a small sonar unit, and a specially designed remotely operated underwater vehicle, ROV, for collecting deep water samples. The outfitter in Ely seemed concerned when I explained I'd be going solo. Lac La Croix this time of year? He frowned, studying my permit. That's deep water, old water. That's precisely why I'm going, I explained. Its thermal properties are unique in the region. He nodded slowly. Just be respectful of it. The Ojibwe call it grandfather water for a reason. Been there since the glaciers retreated. Seen things we can't imagine. I smiled politely, accustomed to locals anthropomorphizing natural features. It was charming, if scientifically irrelevant. I'll treat it with the utmost respect, I assured him. See that you do, he replied, his expression somber. Take only samples, leave only ripples, and maybe don't look too deep. I dismissed his warning as colorful local superstition and began my journey. The first 3 days were productive and uneventful. I paddled across interconnected lakes, portaging between them with my equipment secured in waterproof cases. The autumn colors were at their peak, maples blazing crimson against the dark green pines, their reflections doubled in the still waters. I established a rhythm, paddled by day, made camp in early evening, reviewed data after dinner, sleep soundly in the pristine silence. On the 4th day, I reached Lac La Croix. It was larger than I'd expected, stretching beyond the horizon like an inland sea. Unlike the other lakes I traversed, which were typically clear enough to see several meters down, Lac La Croix's waters were curiously opaque, not murky or sediment-filled, but densely, uniformly dark, as if light simply ceased to exist beyond a certain depth. I established base camp on a small, rocky island near the center of the lake, where depths reportedly exceeded 60 meters. After setting up my tent and equipment, I conducted initial surface measurements: temperature, pH, dissolved oxygen, conductivity. All values were within normal parameters, if slightly unusual for a lake at this latitude in late September. That evening, I deployed the ROV for the first time, a compact but sophisticated device equipped with cameras, sampling tools, and environmental sensors. I'd use it in dozens of research locations around the world, from alpine lakes to Arctic fjords. It was designed to operate at depths up to 100 meters, transmitting video and data back to a small control unit on the surface. The ROV descended smoothly, its lights illuminating the water in a narrow cone of visibility. The first 15 meters were unremarkable. A gradual temperature decrease, scattered organic debris floating in the water column, the occasional small fish darting at the edge of the light's reach. At 30 meters, I encountered the thermocline, the boundary layer where temperature drops rapidly. This was expected, though it was unusually sharp and well-defined for a lake in autumn transition. The water below this boundary was noticeably darker, absorbing the ROV's lights more readily than the layers above. At 45 meters, I noticed something odd. The ROV's camera showed what appeared to be structures on the lake bed. Regular, geometric shapes that seemed inconsistent with natural formations. Stone walls, perhaps? Sunken buildings? There was no record of significant human settlements around Lac La Croix before the area became protected wilderness, and certainly nothing that would leave such substantial underwater remains. I guided the ROV closer for a better look. The structures were indeed artificial. Rectangular foundations arranged in a rough circle, surrounding what appeared to be a central plaza or gathering space. The stonework was crude but deliberate, reminiscent of prehistoric constructions I'd seen documented in archaeological journals. But how could such structures exist here, dozens of meters beneath a remote northern lake, undiscovered by previous surveys? And how had they remained so well preserved in an environment that should have broken them down or buried them in sediment centuries ago? As I maneuvered the ROV through what must have once been a doorway, its lights illuminated something that made me gasp audibly in my empty camp. Carvings. The interior walls were covered with them. Spirals, concentric circles, humanoid figures with elongated limbs, and symbols I couldn't begin to interpret. They appeared freshly cut, their edges sharp and distinct, showing none of the erosion one would expect from submerged. I used the ROV's manipulator arm to collect a small fragment of the stone that had already broken away, placing it in one of the sample containers for later analysis. As the arm made contact with the structure, I felt something like a vibration travel up through the ROV's tether cable, a subtle but distinct tremor that the device wasn't designed to transmit. At that moment, the ROV's video feed flickered, and the depth sensor jumped from 47 meters to 82 meters without the device having moved. Impossible. The lake wasn't charted to be that deep, and the ROV had certainly not descended further. I checked the other sensors. Temperature had dropped precipitously, now reading near freezing, and the water pressure indicated a depth consistent with the anomalous 82-meter reading. The video steadied, revealing a different scene entirely. The stone structures were gone. The ROV now hovered above what appeared to be a vast expanse of, I hesitated to call it vegetation, though that was the closest analogy. Pale, translucent fronds swayed in a current that shouldn't exist at this depth, reaching upward like beseeching hands. They emitted a faint bioluminescence, pulsing in patterns that seemed almost deliberate. I'd studied freshwater ecosystems for decades and had never encountered anything remotely like this. Part of me, the scientist, was thrilled at what might be an undiscovered species. Another part, more primal, more aware, felt a creeping dread. As I watched transfixed, the plants began to move more purposefully, their movements coordinating across the visible field. They were forming a pattern, concentric circles spiraling inward toward a central point, identical to one of the carvings I'd observed on the stone walls. This was not random movement. This was communication. The ROV systems began to fail. First the manipulator arm, then the external temperature sensors. The video feed degraded, becoming grainy and discolored. But before it failed completely, I glimpsed something massive moving at the edge of the ROV's lights. Something that displaced the luminescent fronds in a wave of deliberate motion. Something that was approaching the device with purpose. The video feed cut to static. The tether cable went suddenly taut, nearly pulling control unit from my hands. Then, just as abruptly, it went slack. The ROV was gone. The cable severed or disconnected somehow, leaving me with nothing but a blank screen and a length of useless tether. I sat in stunned silence as darkness settled over the lake. My mind raced through rational explanations. Equipment failure, a submarine landslide, perhaps the ROV had become entangled in submerged branches, and the cable had snapped when I tried to retrieve it. None of these explanations accounted for what I'd seen. The structures, the carvings, the impossible depth reading, the luminescent organisms moving with evident intelligence. I barely slept that night, my dreams filled with pale, reaching fronds and ancient stone doorways. I woke before dawn to the sound of water lapping against the shore, not the gentle rhythm of normal lake waves, but a deliberate, irregular pattern, almost like speech rendered in liquid form. At first light, I intended to break camp and leave. Whatever I discovered was beyond the scope of my research, perhaps beyond the scope of conventional scientific understanding altogether. But as I emerged from my tent, I noticed something on the rocky shoreline that hadn't been there the evening before. The sample container from the ROV, the one containing the stone fragment I collected from the underwater structure. It sat perfectly centered on a flat rock at the water's edge, untouched and sealed. Impossible return from depths that should have rendered it irretrievable. Scientific curiosity overwhelmed caution. I approached slowly, lifted the container, and examined it in the early morning light. The stone fragment inside was intact, but changed. What had appeared to be rough-hewn rock now displayed intricate carvings on every surface. Microscopic symbols and patterns that shimmered slightly when tilted toward the light, as if embossed with some reflective material that hadn't been present before. As I studied the transformed artifact, I became aware of a sound from the lake behind me, a subtle disturbance in the water's surface. I turned slowly, the sample container clutched in my hand. The lake was moving, not with waves or current, but with deliberate, coordinated motion. The dark surface rippled in expanding concentric circles centered directly offshore from where I stood. As I watched, transfixed, the ripples began to coalesce, the water rising into a column perhaps 2 meters high and 1 meter in diameter. The column held its shape, impossible given the fluid dynamics of ordinary water, and began to rotate slowly. Light passing through it refracted strangely, creating prismatic patterns that danced across the rocky shore. Within the column's translucent form, darker shapes moved and shifted, suggesting a structure or presence within the water itself. Fear urged me to run, to flee back to my tent and the illusory safety it offered. But something else, a compulsion not entirely my own, kept me rooted in place, the sample container growing strangely warm in my grasp. Then I heard it, not with my ears, but somehow directly within my mind, a voice unlike any human speech, yet perfectly comprehensible. You have taken. Now you must receive. The column of water pulsed, sending a ripple outward that stopped precisely at my feet. We have existed since the ice retreated. Before your kind named us, before your kind knew itself, we are the memory of this place. I struggled to speak, my throat constricted with fear and wonder. What were you? The water column shimmered, its internal structures realigning in complex patterns. We are the waters. The waters are us. Separate, unified. Your language lacks precision. My scientific mind grasped for framework, for context. A collective intelligence? A symbiotic relationship between water and something else. Taxonomy is irrelevant. We observed your curiosity, your measurements, your small machine that touched what should remain untouched. I looked down at the sample container in my hand, understanding blooming with terrible clarity. The stone fragment. It wasn't just stone, was it? It was memory, solidified, preserved. You removed it from context. Now context must be provided. Before I could respond, the water column surged forward, not touching me physically, but somehow reaching into my mind with liquid tendrils of awareness. Images and sensations flooded my consciousness. The lake, as it was 20,000 years ago, covered in glacial ice kilometers thick. The first pools forming as the ice retreated, alive with primitive organisms. Indigenous peoples arriving, recognizing something different about these waters, leaving offerings at the shore. European voyagers paddling across the surface, feeling watched but seeing nothing. And through it all, a growing, learning presence within the water itself. Not a single entity, but a network, a system of awareness using the unique properties of water as both medium and memory storage. The mental touring continued, showing me the underwater structures, not built by human hands, but grown by the lake itself, using dissolved minerals precipitated into solid form over centuries. A physical manifestation of memory, of history, of identity. The images accelerated, became overwhelming. I saw myself through inhuman perception, a temporary assemblage of water molecules briefly configured into consciousness, arrogantly measuring and sampling a vastly older awareness. I saw what dwelled in the impossible depths of Lac La Croix, the central intelligence that coordinated the network that had been accumulating knowledge and experience since before humans walked the continent. I saw its true form, and the fragile barriers of my human mind began to buckle under the comprehension. Then, mercifully, the vision ceased. The water column remained before me, pulsing gently, waiting. Now you understand. Partially, as much as your configuration allows. I was shaking uncontrollably, the sample container slipping from my nerveless fingers to crack open on the rocks. The stone fragment fell out, immediately beginning to dissolve into fine sand that was drawn toward the water column as if magnetized. The memory returns to the whole, but an impression remains within you, a responsibility. What do you want from me? I managed, my voice barely a whisper. Want is imprecise. Need is closer. You will carry awareness. You will speak caution to your kind. The waters are not for measuring, not for taking, not for changing. We have tolerated. We have watched. We have waited. But tolerance has limits. The column began to recede, collapsing back into the dark surface of the lake. As it diminished, one final thought impressed itself into my consciousness. Water flows through all, through soil, through air, through flesh. We are everywhere, watching, remembering. Return the balance, or we will restore it ourselves. Then it was gone, the lake's surface once again still and opaque, revealing nothing of what lay beneath. I broke camp in a daze, leaving behind most of my scientific equipment, taking only what I needed to find my way back to civilization. The journey out passed in a blur of mechanical paddling and portaging, my mind still reeling from what I'd experienced. When I reached the outfitter's shop in Ely, the owner took one look at my face and nodded slowly. You look too deep, he said simply. I never published my findings from Lac La Croix. How could I? Lake contains ancient water consciousness. Isn't the sort of claim that advances a scientific career. I quietly retired from active research, citing health concerns, and moved to a small cottage in the Scottish Highlands, far from major water bodies. I still practice science in my way. I've been documenting changes in local water systems, subtle shifts in behavior that most would attribute to climate change or pollution, but which I recognize as something more deliberate, more aware. I've also become something of a water conservation zealot, speaking at conferences, lobbying politicians, writing articles about protecting aquatic ecosystems. My colleagues think it a charming eccentricity, a retired scientist finding purpose in environmental activism. They don't know I'm fulfilling a promise, carrying an awareness, speaking caution, because I understand now what most humans never grasp. We are not the dominant consciousness on this planet. We're just the loudest, the most disruptive. The water was here long before us, will remain long after us, and has been watching us, judging us, all along. The rain's picking up again, isn't it? Listen to its rhythm on the window. Does it still sound random to you? Or can you hear the pattern now? The deliberate cadence of liquid communication? Fill a glass from your tap tonight. Hold it up to the light. Look closely at what you've taken for granted all your life. The most common substance on Earth. The main component of your own body. It's looking back at you. It remembers everything you've done to it, and its patience is running out. The rain against your window has a certain persistence to it, doesn't it? A steady rhythm, like fingers drumming, waiting for acknowledgement, like something trying to wear down resistance through sheer, patient determination. Have you ever felt truly alone? Not the solitude of an empty house or a quiet afternoon, but the profound isolation that comes with knowing you're beyond the reach of help, that no one knows exactly where you are, that no one would hear you if you screamed. I have, on an island that shouldn't exist, on a lake that doesn't forgive mistakes. I'm a cartographer by trade, have been for nearly 3 decades. I specialize in wilderness mapping, updating navigational charts for areas where GPS is unreliable and satellite imagery can't capture the nuances of terrain. Boundary Waters Canoe Area was a perfect assignment. Over 1 million acres of wilderness with thousands of islands across hundreds of interconnected lakes. Maps of the region existed, of course, but many hadn't been properly updated since the 1960s. 4 years ago, I was contracted to resurvey portions of the Minnesota-Canadian border lakes, with particular focus on Seagull Lake, a sprawling, island-dotted body of water known for its confusing topography and navigational challenges. My task was straightforward: paddle the lake systematically, verify existing features, note discrepancies, and record any unmapped elements using precision GPS equipment. I'd done similar work in remote areas around the world: the Scottish Highlands, Patagonia, northern Norway. I preferred working alone. It allowed me to maintain my own pace and eliminated the distractions of companionship. The Boundary Waters had restrictions on group size anyway, and solo permits were easier to obtain, especially in late September when tourist traffic had diminished. The outfitter in Grand Marais, who supplied my canoe and basic equipment, seemed concerned when I explained my mission. Seagull this time of year? He studied my mapped route with a frown. Tricky navigation, even in good conditions. Weather can turn fast. And you're planning to camp on the islands. That's the job, I replied, perhaps more curtly than necessary. I need to verify their positions, sizes, and topographical features. He nodded slowly. Most of them are well documented. But that lake, it has a way of rearranging itself sometimes. Old-timers say the islands move when no one's looking. I smiled thinly, accustomed to locals embellishing their wilderness with folk tales. I'll be sure to note any ambulatory landmasses in my report. He didn't return my smile. Just stick to the charted islands. Mark what doesn't match. But don't go exploring anything that isn't on your maps already. Some things aren't meant to be cataloged. I dismiss his warning as a sort of mystical nonsense often directed at outsiders. The wilderness doesn't move. It doesn't hide. It doesn't have intention. It simply exists, waiting to be measured, mapped, and understood. I was wrong about so many things. The first 3 days were productive, if uneventful. Perfect autumn weather allowed for efficient paddling and precise measurements. I established a routine. Break camp at dawn, canoe to a series of islands, take readings, make notes, occasionally update my hand-drawn field map, then find a suitable campsite before dusk. Each night, I transfer my findings to the master map and digital backup, gradually building a more accurate picture of Seagull Lake's intricate geography. On the 4th day, the weather shifted. A cold front moved in from the northwest, bringing low clouds and a steady, chilling rain. Visibility decreased to less than a quarter mile in some directions. I considered taking a rest day, waiting out the weather in camp, but deadlines loomed. Instead, I donned my rain gear, secured my equipment in waterproof cases, and set out to survey the northeastern arm of the lake. By midday, the rain had intensified, driven by gusting winds that created white caps on the normally placid water. I fought to keep the canoe on course, But between the rain-obscured visibility and the increasingly confused surface of my compass, navigation became challenging. I decided to make for the nearest island and wait out the worst of the storm. According to my map, a small island, little more than an exposed rock outcropping with a few stunted pines, should have been directly ahead. But as I paddled through the curtain of rain, nothing materialized. I checked my GPS unit, but the screen displayed only error messages, not unusual in remote areas during stormy conditions. I paddled onward, certain I'd find the island momentarily. When nothing appeared after 20 minutes, I consulted my map again. Either my position was wildly off, or the island simply wasn't where it was supposed to be. As I considered my options, a dark shape emerged through the rain to my right. An island substantially larger than the one I'd been seeking, but welcome nonetheless. I altered course, fighting the wind and waves to reach its lee shore. The island was curious. Perhaps 3 acres in total, densely forested with ancient-looking pines and cedars that shouldn't have been able to establish themselves on such a small landmass. A narrow, pebbly beach provided perfect landing for my canoe. I secured my craft well above the waterline, unloaded essential gear, and sought shelter beneath the tree canopy, where the rainfall diminished to a gentle patter. After catching my breath, I consulted my map again. There was no island recorded at this location, not even a navigational hazard or submerged reef. According to the official charts, I was sitting on open water. As a cartographer, I'm accustomed to finding discrepancies between maps and reality. Features erode, shorelines change, new formations occasionally emerge due to dropping water levels. But an entire island, substantial enough to support mature forest, simply missing from all existing documentation, that was unprecedented. My professional instincts took over. I retrieved my surveying equipment from the canoe and began taking measurements, recording coordinates, and sketching the island's outline. The rain continued steadily, but my excitement overrode discomfort. I discovered something significant, a major correction to existing maps that would be undeniably valuable to my employers. As I worked my way around the perimeter, I noticed oddities in the island's composition. The trees were species common to the region, but they appeared unusually ancient, gnarled, twisted forms that suggested centuries of growth. Far older than the forest should be given the geological history of the area. The underbrush was sparse, with little deadfall or natural debris, and the ground itself felt somehow resilient underfoot, almost like walking on a surface with slight give, as if something lay beneath a thin crust of soil. Most curious of all were the stones, scattered throughout the island, partially buried or nestled among tree roots, were smooth, rounded stones of various sizes, all bearing faint carvings, spirals, concentric circles, and peculiar linear patterns that reminded me of primitive writing. They weren't random. They formed a pattern themselves, gradually increasing in size and frequency as I moved toward the island center. By late afternoon, with the rain showing no signs of abating, I decided to make camp. The island's interior featured a small clearing, carpeted with moss and surrounded by the largest of the pines. It was perfect, sheltered, dry, and level. I set up my tent, arranged my equipment to dry, and prepared a simple meal on my camp stove. As twilight deepened into true darkness, I became aware of the island's unusual silence. No lapping of waves against the shore, though the wind still moaned through the treetops. No rustling of small creatures in the underbrush. No calls of night birds or insects. Just profound, absolute silence beneath the steady rhythm of rain on canvas. I attributed my unease to the day's navigational confusion and the oddity of finding an unmapped feature. After reviewing my notes and updating my field map to include the island, I switched off my headlamp and settled into my sleeping bag. I woke suddenly in the darkest part of night, instantly alert though I couldn't identify what had roused me. The rain had stopped. The silence was absolute. Not even wind disturbed the stillness. I lay motionless, listening. Then I felt it, a subtle vibration through ground, transmitted through my sleeping pad. Not the sharp jolt of seismic activity, but a gentle, rhythmic tremor, almost like distant machinery or breathing. I sat up, fumbling for my headlamp. As the beam cut through the darkness, I noticed something immediately wrong with my tent. The walls, normally taut when properly pitched, sagged inward despite no wind or precipitation weighing them down. More alarmingly, the ground sheet showed distinct impressions around my sleeping pad, as if the soil beneath had softened and molded itself around my body's pressure points. The vibration continued, now perceptible as a pattern. 3 pulses pause, 3 pulses pause, like a heartbeat, but slower, much slower. I unzipped the tent and stepped outside, headlamp sweeping across the clearing. In the hours since I had made camp, the moss had grown, not just a little, but substantially. What had been ankle height was now nearly to my knees in places, and it moved slightly, rippling in patterns that corresponded to vibrations I felt. The carved stones I had documented earlier now protruded more prominently from the ground, as if they'd risen during the night. Their markings seemed freshly cut, more distinct, and in the artificial light, they appeared to glisten with moisture that wasn't rainwater, too viscous, too iridescent. A naturalist might have found rational explanations. Unusual moss species responded to changing barometric pressure, stones frost-heaved by suddenly dropping temperatures, optical illusions created by unfamiliar terrain and artificial light. But something more primal in me recognized truth. This island was wrong. Not simply unmapped or undocumented. Wrong in a way that defied conventional categorization. I retreated to my tent, suddenly desperate to wait out the remaining hours of darkness in illusion of shelter. Sleep was impossible. I sat cross-legged on my sleeping pad, headlamp illuminating my map, trying to determine my exact position and the quickest route back to established campsites in the morning. The vibrations gradually intensified. The 3-pulse pattern remained consistent, but each tremor now pressed visibly upward through the tent floor. My compass, placed on a ground sheet, began to rotate slowly, its needle spinning in lazy circles independent of any movement I made. Around 3 a.m., I heard the first sound since waking. A low, reverberating tone that seemed to emanate from the island itself, not from any specific direction, but from everywhere at once, as if the ground beneath me was a giant soundboard. The note held for perhaps 30 seconds, then slowly modulated to a different pitch. Then another, and another, a sequence that repeated with the same deliberate rhythm as the pulsing vibrations. I've heard indigenous songs, whale communications, and geological recordings of ice fields breaking apart. This resembled all and none of them. Something musical yet mathematical, both organic and structured in a way human compositions are not. It was communication. I was certain of it, but not directed at me or any other surface dweller. This was something speaking to itself, or perhaps to whatever lay beneath the island. As the sound continued, I noticed a change in quality of light within my tent. My headlamp, still functioning, now seemed to illuminate less area, as if the darkness had become more resistant to penetration. Worse, the beam revealed a gradual change in the tent walls themselves. The fabric appeared to be thinning, becoming translucent in places, revealing shadowy movement beyond. The moss growing visibly, the stones shifting position, the very contours of the island rearranging themselves. I'm not ashamed to admit I was terrified. All scientific objectivity had dissolved, replaced by the animal certainty that I was in the presence of something outside my understanding, something ancient and aware that had existed long before humans paddled these waters, and would remain long after. The vibrations abruptly ceased. The sound cut off mid-note. The unnatural stillness that followed was somehow worse than what preceded it. Like the hell breath from directly beneath my tent came a new sensation. Pressure pushing upward, as if something enormous was rising toward the surface. The ground sheet bulged visibly, the fabric stretching as soil and stone distended beneath it, not violently or rapidly, but with the inexorable patience of growth, of geological processes, of time itself manifesting in physical form. I abandoned all pretense of courage or scientific inquiry. Grabbing only my map, compass, and headlamp, I burst in the tent and ran toward the shore where I'd left my canoe. The forest that had seemed merely unusual by day had transformed entirely. The trees had rotated, their trunks now spiraling in patterns matching the stone carvings. The moss carpeted everything, pulsing with subtle bioluminescence that created a ghostly blue-green glow throughout the undergrowth. Most terrifying of all, the path I'd followed had vanished. Where open space had been, trees now grew in formations too dense to pass. Not newly sprouted, but ancient, gnarled specimens that couldn't possibly have appeared overnight, yet somehow had. I was being redirected, channeled, herded back toward the center. I tried another direction, then another, finding each attempt blocked by impassable vegetation or sudden changes in terrain. My headlamp beam weakened with each passing minute, darkness closing in as my options dwindled. In desperation, I attempted to circle the island's perimeter, reasoning that I would eventually find my landing spot regardless of the apparent changes in topography. But after 20 minutes of scrambling through increasingly bizarre terrain, I found myself back at the central clearing. My tent was gone. In its place was a perfect circle of those carved stones, now arranged in a spiral pattern that converged on a central depression in the ground, a depression approximately the size and shape of a human body. The vibrations resumed, more intense than before, the three-pulse rhythm now visible as actual waves passing through the soil, rippling outward from the depression like heartbeats. A sound rose from the center of the spiral, not the tonal sequence I had heard earlier, but something like a voice, though no human vocal cords could produce such resonance. It spoke no language I recognized, yet somehow I understood with perfect clarity. Join us. Become part of the mapping. Your knowledge added to ours. Your perceptions incorporated. Your existence continued in a different form. The invitation, and it was unmistakably that, not a threat or demand, carried with a flood of impressions. I glimpsed what the island truly was. Not land at all, but a vast composite organism that had existed in these waters for millennia. Part fungal network, part collective consciousness, part something entirely outside terrestrial classification. It had incorporated countless smaller organisms over its existence, from microscopic lake life to larger creatures that had made the mistake of lingering too long on its surface. Each edition brought new perspectives, new understanding, new ways of perceiving reality. Each was preserved after a fashion, their essential pattern maintained within the greater whole. I saw what would happen if I accepted. My body would be gradually absorbed, painlessly integrated into the living matrix of the island. My consciousness would dissolve into the collective, my memories and knowledge becoming accessible to the whole. I would experience existence from entirely new perspectives, feeling the passage of seasons not as discrete events, but as waves of change flowing through a unified system. Perceiving time not as linear progression, but as endless cycles within cycles. Part of me, the scientist, the explorer, the seeker of knowledge, was tempted. What greater discovery could there be than to experience consciousness beyond the limitations of an individual human mind? But something more fundamental rejected the offer with visceral certainty. Whatever I might become would no longer be me in any meaningful sense. My selfhood would be subsumed, my autonomy ended. Whatever continued would be, at best, an echo of my existence, preserved like an insect in amber. No, I said aloud, my voice shockingly ordinary in that extraordinary place. I need to leave. Now! The vibrations intensified momentarily, then settled into a different rhythm. Faster, more agitated. You sought to map what should remain unmapped, to fix in place what must remain fluid, to know what must remain unknown. There is a cost to such presumption. The ground beneath me softened, becoming spongy and yielding. I scrambled backward, barely maintaining my footing as the moss attempted to entangle my boots. We do not force, but neither do we release knowledge freely gained. A compromise mapper fixed things. Before I could respond, the island shuddered, a full-body convulsion that knocked me to my knees. The trees groaned, the stones clattered against each other, and the very air seemed to compress momentarily, as if the entire island had inhaled sharply. When the convulsion passed, the path to the shore lay open before me, a direct route through suddenly accommodating forest. My headlamp, nearly exhausted moments before, now shone with renewed brightness, illuminating the way with perfect clarity. I ran. I'd like to claim I maintained scientific composure, that I continued to observe and analyze even in retreat. The truth is far less dignified. I fled with the blind panic of prey escaping predator, driven by instincts far older than rational thought. My canoe remained where I'd left it, untouched and ready. I launched it with desperate haste, paddling furiously away from that impossible shore. Only when I put several hundred meters of water between myself and the island did I dare to look back. It was changing even as I watched. The trees were retracting, the contours flattening, the entire formation seemingly condensing into itself. Within minutes, what had been a substantial, forested island was nothing more than a low, rocky outcropping barely breaking the lake's surface. Exactly the sort of feature that might be overlooked by previous surveys, especially in poor weather. By dawn, I'd paddled halfway across the lake, my arms leaden with exhaustion, but my resolve undiminished. As sunlight gradually illuminated the waters around me, I looked back. The island was gone. No outcropping, no shoal, no indication any land had ever existed at that location. Just open water, placid in the morning light. I completed my contract, submitting maps that reflected only verified, conventional features. I made no mention of the unmapped island or my experience upon it. What would I have said? What evidence could I have provided? I'd fled with nothing but my map and compass. No photographs, no samples, no documentation of what I'd encountered. But the island exacted its promised cost. My maps, meticulously prepared and professionally presented, contained subtle but significant errors, not where I deliberately introduced them, but throughout, islands slightly misplaced, shorelines inaccurately rendered, channels marked as shallower or deeper than reality. I discovered this only months later, when reports filtered back of canoeists becoming disoriented when using my charts, of features appearing where none were marked, of marked features seemingly absent when sought. My professional reputation suffered. My credibility was questioned. Eventually, I was quietly removed from consideration for future contracts. More disturbing were the changes to my perception. Since that night, I've become increasingly aware of subtle movements in supposedly fixed elements of landscape. From the corner of my eye, I'll catch hills changing their contours, trees repositioning themselves when not directly observed, buildings subtly altering their architectural details between glances. I've attempted to document these changes with photography, but the results are infuriatingly inconclusive. The camera never captures a transition, only the before and after, with no proof the difference isn't simply my misremembering. I know how this sounds. Delusional, paranoid, the result of trauma or stress or simple mental deterioration. Perhaps that's all it is. The human mind is fragile, after all, and mine was subjected to something well outside normal experience. But I don't think so. I believe I glimpsed something that night on Seagull Lake, a perspective on reality that most humans are mercifully spared. The world is not as fixed or solid as we pretend. Consensus reality is maintained not by immutable physical laws, but by a kind of collective agreement. And sometimes, in remote places where that consensus wears thin, other possibilities manifest. The island let me go, but it kept a piece of me, my absolute certainty about the nature of physical reality. And in exchange, it gave me something I never wanted, the constant, nagging awareness that the world shifts when we're not looking. That maps are, at best, temporary approximations, that nothing is truly fixed in place or form. Listen to the rain. Does its pattern still seem random to you? Or can you hear a rhythm emerging now, a deliberate sequence tapping against a glass? 3 pulses. Pause. 3 pulses. Pause. It remembers me. It's still mapping me in its way. And sometimes on nights like this, I wonder if it's still offering the same choice. Still waiting for me to reconsider, to become part of the mapping, to surrender the burden of individual perception for something larger, older, more comprehensive, to let go of the exhausting pretense that reality is fixed and knowable. On nights like this, I find myself listening more carefully than I should, and wondering what it would be like to finally say yes. The rain drumming against your window reminds me of that night. The persistent patter, the occasional gust driving harder against glass. A rhythm that lulls you into a false sense of security. A white noise that masks other sounds. Sounds you might want to hear. Sounds that might warn you. I've been a wilderness firefighter for most of my adult life. 27 years battling blazes across 3 continents. From Australian bushfires to Californian forests to the Amazon, I've seen fire in all its forms, creative, destructive, purifying, consuming. I thought I understood it, as much as anyone can understand an elemental force. Until that autumn in Minnesota's Boundary Waters. I wasn't there professionally. After a particularly brutal fire season in British Columbia, I'd taken a month's leave for some proper solitude. Wilderness canoeing had always been my preferred escape. Just me, basic supplies, and waterways that could carry me far from sirens, radios, and the lingering smell of smoke that never quite leaves your nostrils after a decade in service. The Boundary Waters seemed perfect. Over 1 million acres of protected wilderness, with strict limits on visitor numbers and motorized access. I planned a 10-day solo canoe trip through the less trafficked northern routes, aiming to reach the most remote lakes where I might not see another human for days. The outfitter in Ely who provided my canoe and gear seemed concerned when I told him my intended route, Moose Lake, and up through Ensign to Ima in Jordan in October. He studied my permit with a frown. Not many folks go that way this late in the season. Weather can turn nasty quick. You experienced. I explained my background briefly, mentioning my firefighting career more as evidence of wilderness competence than anything else. His expression shifted subtly. Fire service, huh? Interesting. He tapped the map where I'd indicated my planned campsite on the northern arm of Moose Lake. This area had a bad burn about 40 years back. 1,000 acres gone in a night. Official report blamed lightning, but he trailed off, shaking his head. But I prompted. Local stories say different. Say that fire behaved wrong, moved against the wind, burned in patterns, split and rejoined like it was hunting. He shrugged. Just old-timer talk, probably. But if you're camping up that way, no fires, even if it's pouring rain, even if you're freezing, use your stove. I nodded, accustomed to locals embellishing their wilderness with dramatic tales. Fire doesn't hunt. It doesn't think. It simply follows the immutable laws of physics. Fuel, oxygen, heat. My entire career was built on understanding these principles. I'm always careful with fire, I assured him. His eyes held mine for a moment too long. Being careful assumes you're the one in control. 3 days into my trip, I reached Moose Lake. The weather had been unseasonably warm for October, but the forecast warned of a cold front approaching. I pushed on to the northern arm, where the lake narrowed and fewer visitors ventured. By late afternoon, I found a perfect campsite on a small peninsula, elevated enough to avoid flooding if the weather turned, but sheltered by a stand of mature red pines. As I set up camp, I noted the forest composition with professional interest. The area had indeed experienced major fire, evidenced by the relatively uniform age of the pines. About 40 years of growth, consistent with the outfitter's story. Fire ecology is a subject I know intimately. The regeneration patterns here were textbook examples of boreal forest recovery, yet something felt subtly wrong. In a typical post-fire regrowth, you'd expect diverse succession, aspens and birches establishing first, followed gradually by conifers. This forest was almost exclusively red pine, with little understory variation, as if the burn had been extraordinarily selective in what it consumed and what it spared. I dismissed these thoughts as professional overthinking. Not every fire site needs to be analyzed. I was here to escape work, not bring it with me. By evening, the forecasted weather arrived. Dark clouds rolled in from the northwest, bringing steady rain and dropping temperatures. I prepared a simple meal on my camp stove beneath the vestibule of my tent, then settled in for the night, listening to raindrops drumming against the canvas. Sleep came easily after a day of paddling. I dreamed of fire, not unusual for me, as it occupies so much of my waking life. But these flames were oddly articulated, moving with deliberate precision rather than chaotic hunger. In the dream, I stood in a forest clearing, watching as a ring of fire closed around me. Its movements synchronized like dancers following choreography. I woke suddenly, disoriented. The rain had intensified. Now a proper downpour accompanied by gusting wind that bent the tent walls inward. But it wasn't a storm that had roused me. It was the smell. Smoke. For a firefighter, that scent triggers immediate alertness. I sat up, instantly awake, nostrils flaring as I tried to identify the source. It wasn't wood smoke from a campfire, sharper, more acrid, with an underlying sweetness that suggested chemistry rather than natural combustion. My first thought was that my camp stove had somehow activated, that propane was leaking, but the smell wasn't right for that either. Lightning, then, a nearby strike, igniting a tree despite the rain. I pulled on my boots and rain jacket, then unzipped the tent enough to peer outside. The night was pitch black, the rain falling in sheets that my headlamp could barely penetrate. No sign of fire or smoke visible, yet the smell remained, stronger now that I'd opened the tent, suggesting an external source. I stepped fully outside, sweeping my light across the surrounding forest. Water streamed from the pine boughs, the ground already saturated. Nothing could burn in these conditions. I knew this with professional certainty. Yet as I completed my survey, something caught my eye at the forest edge. A brief flicker of orange light, there and gone so quickly I might have imagined it. I moved toward it, rain pelting my hood, mud sucking at my boots. At the tree line, I paused, playing my light between the trunks, seeing nothing but rain-soaked bark and needle-covered ground. Then it came again, a dull orange glow between distant trees, like embers pulsing in a dying fire. Impossible, but my eyes weren't deceiving me. Professional instinct took over. If there was fire, even improbable fire, I needed to investigate. I grabbed my emergency kit from the tent, secured the rainfly, and plunged into the forest, following that mysterious glow. The smell intensified as I moved deeper among the pines. That same acrid sweetness, now underlay with something else, something organic and disturbingly familiar. The scent of cooking meat. The trees thinned suddenly, opening into a clearing I hadn't noticed during my earlier survey of the area. The rain seemed to lessen here, though I could still hear it hammering the canopy above. At the center of the clearing stood a ring of stones, a fire circle far older than the surrounding forest, its rocks blackened by countless flames. And within that circle impossibly burned a fire, not the struggling, smoke-choked attempt you might expect in a downpour, but a robust, steady blaze that the rain seemed to actively avoid. Water fell all around it, but not a single drop appeared to touch the flames themselves, as if an invisible barrier encased the fire pit. More disturbing was the fire's behavior. The flames moved with unnatural precision, forming patterns that shifted and flowed with deliberate intricacy. They would rise suddenly in perfect unison, hold a shape momentarily, a spiral, a series of concentric rings, what looked disturbingly like a human silhouette, then collapse and reform into new configurations. I stood transfixed, my firefighter's knowledge insisting this was impossible even as my eyes confirmed its reality. Fire doesn't do this. Can't do this. Fire is chemistry and physics, not choreography. As if sensing my presence, the flames abruptly ceased their patterned movements and shot upward in a single column, reaching far higher than the available fuel should have permitted. At its peak, the column bent, orienting itself in my direction like a massive, flaming finger pointing directly at me. Then it spoke, not with words, precisely. The sound was more like the voice of fire itself. The crack of exploding sap, the whisper of oxygen being consumed, the deep rumble of heat distorting air, but organized into patterns that somehow formed meanings in my mind. Firewalker, flame fighter, you come to observe. I nearly stumbled backward in shock. 27 years battling wildfires across the globe had not prepared me for one that could communicate. Part of me recognized I might be hallucinating, exhaustion perhaps, or some toxic exposure causing sensory delusions. But the heat on my face was real. The light illuminating the clearing was real. And the sense of being in the presence of something ancient and aware was undeniably, terrifyingly real. What are you? I managed, my voice embarrassingly thin. The flame column pulsed, sending shadows dancing across the clearing. Oh, older than your kind's memory. We burned here when glaciers retreated, before trees, before names. We, I asked, noticing the plural reference. The fire flickered rapidly, its configuration changing to display multiple columnar forms briefly before returning to a single entity. Many in one. Separate flames, unified purpose. Your language lacks precision for our nature. I struggled to comprehend what I was experiencing. Sentient fire? A hallucination? Some elaborate prank using chemicals and hidden mechanisms? None seemed plausible. Yet the conversation continued. You spend your existence extinguishing our kind, limiting, controlling, defining boundaries we may not cross. There was no menace in this observation, just a statement of fact. I found myself responding as I might to a curious stranger asking about my profession. Fire is necessary but dangerous. I control it to protect forests, communities, to save lives. The flame flickered rapidly, patterns shifting in what I somehow recognized as the equivalent of contemplative thought. Your purpose is preservation. Ours is transformation. Not opposed. Complementary. Balance. Rain continued to fall all around us, still mysteriously avoiding the fire itself. The clearing remained dry in a perfect circle radiating from the stone ring, while the forest beyond was drenched in the downpour. You wonder how we speak in water, how we maintain form against opposition. We are not the fire you know, not simple reaction. We are fire that remembers. Remembers what? I asked, scientific skepticism gradually yielding to genuine curiosity. Everything we have consumed, every tree, every creature, every previous fire, all patterns preserved, incorporated, continued. We are living memory expressed through flame. As it communicated, the fire shifted again, now forming shapes I recognize, a perfect replica of a pine tree, a running moose, what appeared to be a human figure raising an axe, each held for moments before dissolving into new forms. The burning your people speak of, 40 years and you're counting. It was necessary. The forest had forgotten itself, become stagnant, unbalanced. We restored pattern. I thought of the strange uniformity I'd noticed in the surrounding forest, the selectivity of what had burned and what had been spared. You controlled that fire, directed it. We were that fire, as we have been many fires, as we will be many more. This place requires periodic renewal, transformation, release. A chill ran through me despite the heat radiating from the flames. If what this entity claimed was true, it suggested an intelligence behind at least some wildfires, not random destruction, but deliberate ecological purpose. My entire professional understanding trembled at the implications. The flame surged suddenly higher, its color shifting from orange to an intense blue-white that hurt my eyes. Time shortens. The water weakens our voice. We have message for firefighter. I found myself stepping closer despite instinctive caution. What message? Change comes. Great burning approaches. Not here, not now, but soon, in your southwest lands. Fire bigger than your methods, stronger than your resistance. You cannot fight it as you have fought others. A wildfire? Where exactly? When? Professional concern overrode my disbelief. When the earth shakes, when wind blows from wrong direction, 3 valleys will burn as one. Necessary, terrible, transformative. The flames began to flicker erratically, the invisible barrier that had held back the rain apparently weakening. Droplets hissed as they penetrated the perimeter, sending small puffs of steam rising from the edges of the fire. Remember, do not fight the pattern. Guide it. Work with its purpose, not against its nature. Evacuation, not confrontation. Thousands of lives in the balance. The column collapsed suddenly, the organized pattern dissolving into more typical, chaotic flames. The rain began to fall normally into a fire circle, quickly reducing the blaze to sputtering embers despite the substantial pile of wood that I could now see had fueled it. I stood motionless, rain soaking through my jacket, trying to process what had just occurred. After several minutes, the fire was completely extinguished, leaving nothing but steaming coals and the lingering scent of that peculiar smoke. Dawn was breaking as I made my way back to my campsite, head spinning with impossible conversations and prophetic warnings. I half expected to find my tent gone, to discover the entire experience had been some vivid hallucination or dream. But the tent stood as I'd left it, real, tangible, an anchor to conventional reality. I broke camp that morning and began paddling back toward the entry point, my wilderness retreat suddenly less appealing than human company and rational explanation. As I rounded the peninsula where I'd camped, I glanced back at the forested area where I'd encountered the fire. From the water, I could clearly see what had been hidden from ground level. The entire stand of red pines was arranged in a perfect spiral pattern, their placement too precise to be natural seeding, as if they had grown exactly where they had been instructed to grow, following the design of whatever had burned there 40 years earlier. I completed my trip in half the planned time, returned to Ely with a story I knew better than to share. Who would believe a firefighter claiming to have had a conversation with sentient fire during a rainstorm? 3 months later, an earthquake struck Southern California, followed by unusual Santa Ana winds blowing from the northeast rather than their typical eastern pattern. Within hours, 3 separate canyons caught fire, eventually merging into what would become one of the most devastating wildfires in the state's history. I was deployed with my unit, arriving as the fires began to merge. One look at the burn pattern, at the way the flames moved against the wind and split to surround certain areas while avoiding others, and I knew this wasn't ordinary fire. This was fire with purpose. I broke protocol. Instead of directing my team to establish containment lines in the southwestern sector as ordered, I redeployed them to evacuation assistance in 3 small communities that weren't yet in the official danger zone. Communities directly in the path of what I somehow knew the fire would do next. My superior was furious, threatening immediate suspension, until the fire did exactly what I predicted, jumping a 6-lane highway and natural fire break to race directly toward those communities. Communities now empty thanks to our early evacuation. When the blaze was finally contained 2 weeks later, those 3 towns were gone, reduced to ash and rubble, but their residents, all 3,417 of them, were alive. The official report credited anomalous fire behavior prediction for the successful evacuation. My colleagues called it incredible intuition born from decades of experience. I never told them about the fire on Moose Lake, about the voice in the flames, about how I sometimes hear it still, whispering in candles, murmuring in hearts, speaking through every instance of controlled flame. I retired from active firefighting the following year. Now I consult on fire behavior prediction and ecological management of controlled burns. My recommendations often puzzle colleagues with their specificity, their seemingly intuitive understanding of how fire wants to move through a landscape. If they only knew I was simply translating, interpreting between elemental intelligence and human comprehension, helping maintain the balance between preservation and necessary transformation. The rain's picking up again, isn't it? Look at the way it strikes the window. Patterns within patterns, messages in the rhythm if you know how to listen. And that candle on your table. Have you noticed how the flame occasionally tilts in your direction, even though there's no draft? How it sometimes forms shapes too precise to be random chance. It's listening to our conversation, curious about the firefighter who learned to speak its language, about the human who now tells its story. Don't be afraid. It means no harm. Fire isn't good or evil, just as rain isn't kind or cruel. It simply is. An elemental force with purpose beyond our limited understanding. But perhaps extinguish it before we continue. Some conversations shouldn't have too many listeners, and some listeners remember everything they hear.